Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Williard, and you're watching the video for food chains in the unit ecology. Food chains we've learned about probably since elementary or middle school, but we're still going to go over and review the information and look at it from slightly different angles, at least once we get towards the end. So first we're just going to review some basic terminology about food chains, what they are, what you call the organisms that are involved in a food chain, and then we'll get to looking at the different trophic levels. So let's get started. So feeding relationships, that's what we're going to focus on first within a food chain. And you have two types of organisms. You have producers and you have consumers. So producers are also known as autotrophs because they're capable of producing their own food through the process of photosynthesis. And we'll learn in more detail about what photosynthesis is later. Just remember, producers make their own food. That's why they're called producers. They're producing, they're making something. Autotroph literally means self-feeding. Auto means self, troph means feeding. So producers are typically your plants, and they are kind of the heart of a food chain and provide the majority of the energy source. But plants aren't the only thing. Some algae, phytoplankton, as well as cyanobacteria and euglena, which are protists, and some bacteria and plankton can also go through photosynthesis and do that process and make their own food. So there we have some euglena and plants, of course. So to be a producer, you have to be able to produce your own food. And if you'll notice in parentheses, you only need to pick 2 of those examples. You do not need to write all 5 of them. Next, we have consumers. So they're the opposite of producers. They can't make their own food, so they have to get it from somewhere else. Humans, us, animals, we're a part of the consumers in a food chain. We're also known as heterotrophs because we need to consume our own food. We have to eat our food from somewhere else to get energy. We cannot make it within our bodies. And it's called heterotroph because hetero means different, troph feeding, so different feeding versus self-feeding. We have to get our energy, we have to get our food from other sources. Other examples? So we have herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, decomposers, and detrivores. And we're going to talk about what all 4 of those things are, what they mean. You've probably heard of herbivore, carnivore, omnivore before. You probably even heard of decomposers. You may not have heard of detrivores, but it still kind of goes along with decomposers. So let's look at each of these more specifically and look at a more scientific definition for them. When you think about herbivores, you think of things that eat plants. That's kind of what you call herbivores in earlier grades. But herbivores are things that only feed on autotrophs, or plants. So herbivores only eat autotrophs, which would be plants, and other things that we just mentioned in this previous slide that are able to also produce their own food but aren't necessarily plants. So examples you have are cows and deer. So they graze all day long on vegetation, on grass and whatever else that they can find. Those are your herbivores. Your carnivores, they're your meat eaters. In other words, they only eat heterotrophs. Okay, so carnivores feed only on other heterotrophs. They don't eat any autotrophs at all. They just eat heterotrophs. They're those meat eaters, just eating other organisms. Examples of carnivores: lions and wolves. Then we have our omnivores, which are both plant and meat eaters. In other words, they eat both autotrophs and heterotrophs. They're a mixture of a diet. Examples are pigs, rats, and some humans. We know that there's lots of different diet choices that humans have. You have some that are vegetarians, so they do only eat autotrophs. And then you have some which are vegan, which is even a little bit more extreme, and they don't eat any animal byproducts at all. So they stay away from dairy as well. And then we have detrivores and decomposers. So they're breaking down and recycling nutrients from dead organisms and wastes. The main difference between decomposers is they do that They release chemicals kind of externally. Detrivores digest it internally. But either way, they're still breaking down dead, decaying matter and recycling that nutrients. So you have fungi and bacteria, or decomposers. Detrivores would be like worms and maggots. Now that we reviewed those simple terms, let's look at an actual food chain and how you place organisms in order and what you call those organisms. So on your paper you have a pyramid that looks like this. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot that there's this section too at the top of your paper to fill in. So food chains show the flow of energy through different organisms. It's not just about who eats who. It's who's giving energy to who as well. It's all about energy. The first organism in the chain is always going to be an autotroph, or always going to be producer. It's the base for that food chain. Autotrophs receive their energy from the sun or inorganic compounds. So all the heterotrophs, all the consumers, receive their energy from producers. The producers will get it from the sun or inorganic compounds. You know, you have some plants and things like that that don't just rely on the sun, like Venus flytraps or whatnot. So let's look at our food chain now. So we're going to have grass at the bottom. Grasshoppers eat the grass. Mice eat the grasshoppers, and we've got an owl that eats the mice. There's different levels to this, and they have different names. We already know the grass is our producer. That's our autotroph. It's at the bottom. It's the base of our food chains. The grasshoppers, the mice, and the owls are our consumers, but we give them a level. So because the grasshoppers are the very first consumer in the food chain, they're called the primary consumer. Because mice come second, they're the secondary consumer. And then last but not least, you have the owl, and that's called your tertiary consumer. And it could go on to quaternary, which would be your fourth level consumer. It's important to note that in a food chain, the highest amount of energy is at the bottom. That's why you also see a food chain depicted in a pyramid as well. The majority of the energy is going to be at this grass. They're getting their grass directly from the main source of energy, which is from the sun. So as far as energy is concerned, about 100% is going to be at the grass. Okay? The grass is not going to transfer every single percent of its energy to the grasshoppers, which are eating it. The grass has got to use some of it for itself. It's got to do photosynthesis so it can make its own food. Some of the energy is also lost as heat. So only about 10% of that energy is going to transfer to the grasshoppers. The 10% of the energy that the grasshoppers get, they've got to do things too. They've got to do respiration. They've got to move. That requires energy. So the mice that eat them are only going to get 10% of that energy, which is going to be 1%. And then the owls, all the way at the top, it's not getting the energy firsthand. It's the last thing to receive that energy. So it's going to have the least amount of energy. So energy decreases as you go up the food chain. There's one more thing that we have to talk about, which is called bioaccumulation. And that's something that's a little bit newer, talking about pesticides and things like that. So if we were to spray pesticides on the grass, it would actually increase as you go up a food chain versus decrease. So the grass is saturated with pesticides. Grasshoppers aren't just going to eat one blade of grass and be satisfied. They're going to have to come back for a whole lot more. So let's say they eat 100 blades of grass. Those pesticides have built up inside of them, and they're going to have more than just one blade of grass would have. Mice don't just eat one grasshopper. They might eat 10. They might eat 20. And throughout their life, they're going to eat even more than that. Same thing with the owl. It's not just going to eat one mouse. So pesticides actually build up as you go up the food chain, and that's called bioaccumulation. So organisms at the top of the food chain actually get a higher concentration in them of pesticides than the grass. So when we spray our crops with pesticides and herbicides and all of that stuff, think about all the plants and things that you eat at the grocery store. Those things are building up in our bodies over time, and we'll get into more detail with pesticides and their use and other things that are bad for the environment when we get into human impact. So let's say you have about 1 gram sprayed on the grass. We're just going to use 10 again to make it nice and easy, increasing as tens as you go up. So the highest concentration is going to be at the top. So energy decreases as you go up the food chain, but bioaccumulation, so things like pesticides, are going to increase as you go up the food chain. This video was a little bit longer, but it just had a little bit more information in it than you needed to know. Thanks for watching, and once again, hopefully you learned something new.